These neighborhoods are our neighborhoods, and these children are our children. And we're going to have to come together and take meaningful action to prevent more tragedies like this, regardless of the politics.
It's not right to talk about this on yesterday. It should have been a year ago. It should have been 2 years ago. It should have been 3 years ago. I'm going to take him as his word that we will try to do something to reduce gun violence in this country. And I'm willing to work with him on what that will be.
I think we have to be careful about suggesting that it's new gun laws. I mean, we need to look at what drives a crazy person to do these kind of actions and make sure that we're enforcing the laws that are currently on the books.
And we are back in Newtown, Connecticut for our special edition of This Week. I am joined on a roundtable by George Will, Donna Brazile, Joe Klein of Time Magazine, 2 members of Congress, Representative Jason Chaffetz and Congresswoman Donna Edwards. And George, let me begin with you. And I watched those clips from earlier this week and Friday and Saturday, and there's a depressing sameness to the conversation coming out of these tragedies.
Yes, and our response is always to think that if there's some defect in the social system or some prompting in the social atmosphere that causes this, and therefore, we assume, we can tailor a law to correct the defect. The problem is the law can do 3 things. It can deter with severe punishments. Of course, we already have lots of deterrence against murder. They can impede the access to public spaces or to weapons. Or third, the law can monitor and in some cases confine people who meet the profile of these people. The problem with this is these people are determined, psychotic, and often suicidal. It's very difficult to deter someone like that or impede. And then when you come to the question of monitoring or confining, you look at the profile. These are often men, young unmarried men, young men who are socially awkward, and sometimes young unmarried socially awkward men who have been diagnosed or even prescribed some kind of psychotropic medicine. The civil liberties and privacy issues involved in trying to monitor people in this not insignificant cohort who fit that profile are insuperable.
Well, you've laid so much on the table right there. Donna, I saw you nodding your head at least parts of it.
Well, yeah, angry, alienated, disconnected from society. They need help. At a time when we're talking about budget cuts, 2/3 of states have cut services to mental health agencies. $1,300 is the cost of treating someone with mental health disorders. $17,000 is what we end up paying when we have no beds, no facilities, when Medicaid cannot fill the gap. The gun safety laws in this country are broken, and I would hope that members of Congress would take a look at some common sense steps that we can take to at least fix the background system so that we can at least know when people are buying guns, who they are, and if they have a record.
I want to go to the members in just a moment. Joe, let me bring that to you, but one of the first things you're going to hear in this case is that the background check wasn't even tripped because all the guns were in the home.
Right. I mean, you know, I think that there are things you could there are things you could do that will limit these incidents. Nothing that you can do that will totally eliminate them. The striking piece of news to me today was that the mother was very angry at the school system for not giving her the support she needed to deal with her son. Right now, all over this country, there are parents of young men with severe psychological problems who are scared to death that their kids are going to go and do something like this too. And in many cases, after they pass the age of 18, these parents may want the children to be in some kind of a residential setting, but they don't have the power, the legal power, to have anything to do with it. We got rid of mental hospitals in this country 50 years ago, and that was a good thing. They were supposed to be replaced by medication and by residential settings like halfway houses, but nobody wanted to have halfway houses in their neighborhoods. So we have abdicated our responsibility to the mentally ill in this country, to the parents of the mentally ill who are suffering right now.
So, Congressman, what is the government's responsibility here?
Well, I wish there was one thing that we could do to make sure that this never, ever, ever happens again. And God bless those families who are dealing with a situation I can't even imagine. But we have to deal with the mental health aspect. I think it's fair game. I think we absolutely should talk about the intersection of a lethal weapon and it relates to mental health. Absolutely, we got to have that discussion in this country. And we also have to deal with the new social ramifications of the bombardment and the immediacy of social interaction between violence, the realism that you find in games and movies. Some people, the young people, as they're making this transition from their teen years into adulthood, aren't able to mentally make that transition, and there does need to be help. But we're also going to need to look to families and communities and churches. It's not just a government solution.
Picking up on what you said, there have been some reports, Congresswoman Edwards, that this young man was, playing a lot of those very violent, very realistic games.
Well, I think that, there are multiple things that we have to do here and use this circumstance of the tragedy in Newtown to create both policy solutions but also cultural solutions. I think that it is true, we have to rebuild or build a fabric for mental health services, especially for young people, to give parents the resources that they need and wrap our hands that this community will need and the surviving families and children. But we've got to get the guns. We just do. There were assault weapons used here, weapons that are used by military and law enforcement. And it seems to me that there can be a bright line for removing those kinds of weapons. There can be a bright line for background checks that don't just cover 60% of the guns that come through gun shows and individual sales. We regulate cars in that respect, knowing who transfers a car more than we know who transfers a weapon. There are real things that we can do, and we have an obligation to it. And if this doesn't call us to action, George, I don't know what will.
And then that's one of the questions we're going to find out an answer to soon, I suppose. But George, about on that point exactly, kind of striking, you read in the 24 hours after this that this a very similar incident happened in China. A man in an elementary school with a knife, not an assault weapon, almost 24 kids injured but not killed.
In 1996, a man went into a gym class in Scotland, killed 16 5- and 6-year-olds and the teacher. A few years ago in Norway, a young, deranged young man killed about 69 people on an island, mostly teenagers. Connecticut has among the toughest gun laws in this country. Didn't help. Scotland and Norway have very tough gun laws. Didn't help. So
didn't stop, but it does lessen the occasion of violence, doesn't it?
And George, since Columbine, there have been 181 of these school shootings.
We did have a ban on assault weapons. When we put the ban in place, these incidents did not really decline in a measurable way, and when we took it off, they didn't increase in a measurable way.
There were 5 guns in that house. The shooter chose 2 semi-automatic pistols and 1 semi-automatic rifle. He did not choose the 2 deer hunting rifles. It seems to me that the Congresswoman is absolutely right. There is a bright line here that we should be able to, to hunt, hunters should be able to go about their sport, but there's no need to hunt with a semi-automatic rifle. There's none.
Congressman?
Well, look, I'm a concealed carry permit holder. I own a Glock 23. I've got a shotgun. I'm not the person you need to worry about, and there are millions of Americans who deal with this properly. It's our Second Amendment right to do so. But we have to look at the mental health access
so is there a
that
Second
these people
Amendment right
have.
to any kind of weapon, any capacity
No, there are
weapon?
prohibitions on lots of, the gun rules are very stringent. There's a lot of conjecture out there that I don't think necessarily would solve this particular problem. And I want to look at anything that we think will solve all the problems, but we have to, I think, look at the mental health aspect.
We do have to look at the mental health aspect, but the complex problems require complex solutions, and it isn't one thing. It's all of these things. And some people would like to deflect the conversation only to the mental health problems that are severe and that we need to deal with without dealing with the reality that we have a lot of weapons out there and people have access to them, and we have to figure out a way that we can protect our children in their kindergarten and first grade classrooms.
I want to bring this to Donna Brazile, and as I do this, Donna, the politics of all this, generally shows, I want to show this Pew poll, support for gun control generally does not go up after these major shootings, whether it was after Aurora, Colorado, went up about 2%, after the Gabby Gifford shooting in Tucson, went actually down 4%. Virginia Tech, it went up a little bit as well back in 2007. And the president has been reluctant to take this on in the past. You saw him on Friday say it is time for, quote, meaningful action. What do you expect? And do you think now that the president is not going to face election again, he will address these matters in a different way?
Well, I hope so, George, because I think there's expectations now, not just from the families, but others who would like to see the president take some concrete steps. He's talked about it before after Aurora, where he said that we need to have tighter restrictions on people with mental disabilities from having access to these guns. He spoke again at the National Urban League about this, but clearly there's a time for this, and hopefully the time is sooner rather than later. You know, as a Southerner, I'm a big advocate of the Second Amendment. I grew up with guns. I grew up with people who understood how to use guns responsibly. I did not grow up with people with assault rifles and all of these other semi-automatic guns. I do believe that we need a conversation, a real deep conversation, and this cannot be stopped simply because people are afraid of the politics.
You also grew up to be the campaign manager of Al Gore, who lost the home state of Tennessee. The myth is, at least in part, because he supported gun control. This is a political, not a jurisprudential problem. The most important case in Second Amendment jurisprudence, the Heller case, concerning an absurdly restrictive D.C. law, is really much more permissive than people realize. And I'm not sure that there'd be a Second Amendment impediment to banning a category of weapons. There would be a political
60,000 murders since Columbine.
And the
gun
large,
murders.
capacity of the men are used in these weapons that allow this perpetrator to go into a school and each of the victims suffering multiple gunshot wounds. This is just not acceptable.
There's I think that we can't think about this in terms of eradication. These incidents are always going to happen.
Reduction.
We can think. The mental health piece is obviously important. I think there's a bright line on gun control as well. But there's a third piece, and that is the celebration of violence. We not only have a Second Amendment in this country, we also have a First Amendment that protects Sylvester Stallone's right to fire thousands of bullets in any given movie. But I think that that what we need to do in this society is treat people who create violent movies and violent video games with the same degree of respect that we accord pornographers.
I want to bring...
They need to be shunned.
And I want to add to that, we're getting a lot of response on Facebook as well about how all of us cover this in the media in the wake of these shootings. I want to show some of that right now. Scott LaMarche, media sensationalism contributes more to this than guns. It's always the person who pulls the trigger, not the gun that kills. We need to stop making these killers famous. Bill Cotton, stop the wall-to-wall coverage. You're helping drive this. Darla Regal, stop glamorizing the killers, keep them with no name. And I have to say, we've actually tried, in this case, to talk a little bit less about the killer. But, Congressman, this is also something, Joe brings up and those viewers bring up as well. How do we talk about this in a way that doesn't encourage the contagion?
I don't know that the news coverage that I've seen is glamorizing the killer as much as allowing the rest of the country to grieve. As a parent, we all shed a tear. I do agree with Joe that you put violence and death and gore in a movie, you're not going to get an R rating. You do something else, okay, but I got to tell you, I think the movie ratings are terribly misleading when it comes to violence, death, gore, and glamorizing.
And all of those things are true because we do have a culture that celebrates violence, but it doesn't take away our responsibility. And I want to urge and challenge my colleague to work with me, to work with us on this so that no parent has to experience what these parents and families do in Newtown. The bright lines between those who are hunters and shooters and outdoors people, but they don't need an assault rifle. They don't need high-capacity magazines that create havoc and viciousness and death. And we can do that. Background checks, we can do that. We can close that up, and then we allow ourselves to enjoy the Second Amendment rights that are so important, but also we respect human life.
George, when my little nephews left New Orleans after Katrina, I'll never forget what they said. Auntie Donna, I don't hear gunshots at night. Too many of our kids are living with guns. They're living with a fear of violence. They're dying sometime in their homes, just walking home from schools. And while this tragedy is incomprehensible, we got to understand that there are too many of our babies who are being murdered every day senseless. And that's why we need to have this conversation.
The question is what to do and what is possible to do.
Well, we got to bring in Mayor Rahm Emanuel of Chicago. Chicago's in an epidemic of violence with young, largely unparented, that is, no father in the home, adolescent males. Now, that's a problem quite separate from this. Another thing that we're going to do, and it makes one's heart sink, is this, George. We're going to ratchet up the security of schools and elsewhere in public spaces. Our public spaces are already blighted by this. For generations, people have been using the water on the mall to run little sailing boats. Now the government, in its wisdom, has banned remote control little boats on the mall water in Washington because it somehow represents a security threat to the country. We have to be a little bit reasonable unless we surround our citizenry with the quite false idea that this is an extremely dangerous country.
And on that point, Joe Klein, people should be reminded, parents should be reminded, that the overwhelming majority of schools in this country are safe.
That's right. Although, you know, I had this creepy feeling walking into this school this morning that I wasn't in a place of safety in this town.
Even though you know rationally that's not true.
It was a completely irrational thought. But I'm sure, and when I say that, I think about all the children who are going to be walking into schools tomorrow.
And that gives us a place we actually have to stop because we want to talk about that with Dr. Richard Besser when we come back. We'll be right back to the special edition of This Week.
This was not God's plan. This was a man who has serious issues in his life. Why he'd want to destroy innocent children, no one can figure out.
We're grieving with you.
I appreciate it. I'm so tired.